Welcome to another episode of Artist Spotlight, the podcast. I'm your host, Mitch Stringer. And as usual, the podcast brought to you by your friends at the Maryland Photography Alliance. You can check out everything they have going on at mdphotoalliance.org. There's always information about contests and different events they have going on. So I encourage you to take a look and see what's there. If you take a look one day and come back a week or 10 days later, odds are there's new content that's been added. And so it really becomes a central point for photographers to be aware of and learn from and just really enjoy. So take a look at the site when you get a chance. I think you'll enjoy it. Today's episode, we are joined by a gentleman who I became aware of a number of years ago. And
you just called me old.
Bob Chapman is our guest, and I tell you, he is a phenomenal motorsports photographer, and I'd say that if he wasn't my guest, but he happens to be here. So Bob, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Mitch. Good morning.
So I became aware of Bob's work looking at some of his motorsport photography, and specifically some of the Porsches that he's photographed over the number of years that he's been doing this. And so, you know, I guess when people hear that you're a motorsports photographer, and this is probably true of a lot of genres, people say, how'd you get into that? How'd you choose that? So I'll start with that. How did you get into becoming really one of the preeminent motorsport photographers out there?
Well, I had a previous professional career in corporate America. Of all things, I was a management and technology consultant in the 1990s. And it turns out that that was not the right career choice for me. It was a rather miserable experience. And so I lived my life away from the office by pursuing things that I was passionate about. And two of the things that I was passionate about were sports car racing and photography. And I'd go to the races. I didn't take my camera in those early days because I didn't have the equipment really to make it worth my while. But I would go to the races and watch, and then my wife and I would go on vacations, and the camera equipment would go with me, and I'd plan the entire vacation around where I'm going to shoot sunrise and sunsets, and it drove her crazy. I let her plan all of the vacations now, but back then I was militant about here's where we need to be when, and because this is the photo that I need to get, and so I was living my professional life in kind of misery. I was really unhappy, and I was really living from vacation to vacation when I could be at the racetrack to watch some races, or I could have my camera in hand and be photographing a sunrise somewhere. And it was only a matter of time before I figured out a way to marry the two. And I owned my first Porsche at the time. This was in the mid 1990s. I had bought a used 911 that was about 12 or 13 years old. And I joined the Porsche Club of America and started going to the racetrack with my Porsche. And I started sticking the camera equipment in the back and trying to convince the guys running the event that whenever I wasn't on the track driving, that I could be standing next to the track pressing the shutter release button. And that's how it all started. And gradually I became more and more interested and more enamored and passionate about motorsports photography specifically. And then when I left corporate America for the first time in 2000, I called up my buddy who was doing all of my film processing at the time, and doing all of my print work. And I said, Greg, I just quit my job and I've got 12 weeks to figure out what I'm going to do next with my life. And he said, well, I'm going down to Daytona for the 24 hours of Daytona sports car race this weekend. Do you want to come? We can split expenses, and I'll introduce you to the guy who has the Porsche photography account. I thought that was a pretty good idea. So, so that was the starting point right there of how I got into this game.
You know, when I think of cars, especially going way back, I think back to myself. I was a kid and I had the Matchbox cars and I had all those kind of things. I built the model cars, and inevitably I'd build a model car and I had about 12 extra parts, which really were an extra. I probably just got frustrated trying to get them to glue them on. Did your interest in cars, not necessarily photographically, but car interest, did that go back to your parents or grandparents, or in my case Matchbox cars, or did it come in later, when you became an adult?
So my earliest memories, my dad was in the Air Force at the tail end of Vietnam, and my earliest memories are Fairbanks, Alaska. He was stationed at Eielson Air Force Base and flew refueling missions for F-4s and did some light reconnaissance over the eastern part of the Soviet Union as Vietnam was winding down. And we had out in the parking lot, we lived on base housing, out in the parking lot, he had a 1970 Camaro RS.
That was some car too.
V8, which is a really strange car to have in Alaska. Okay. You don't, when he moved to Alaska, the first thing that he did was he bought a Saab because he thought the Swedish, they know how to make cars that are gonna perform well
Sure.
in those kind of conditions. So we had a Saab and we had his Camaro, and that was what we had in the parking lot at the apartments where we were. And I don't ever remember being in that Saab. That Saab was a piece of junk, as a matter of fact. But that Camaro was cool. It was one of the long nose 1970, so it was one of the long nose second iteration body styles of the Camaro. But his true passion was Corvairs.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And when he got transferred from Eielson to Andrews, right across the Potomac from DC, uh, we he bought a 65 Corvair, and that was the first time that I was exposed to what the Corvair was. Flat six air-cooled engine in the
Mhm.
rear, a la Porsche 911. And so, to your question, where did the passion come from? It originated from my father. And like you, I had the Matchbox cars. Like you, I had the models. Now, the funny thing about the models, you said you had leftover pieces all of the time. My dad was very mechanically inclined.
Mm.
I was never mechanically inclined. I was never interested in being underneath the car with a wrench in my hand. I was only interested in the aesthetics, the beauty, and watching the motion. And that's what had my interest. And when I made a model, I didn't care about the engine. I didn't care about any of the pieces other than what's the final outside product going to look like? How am I
Mm.
going to paint it? Where are the stickers going to go? And what color is it going to be? What color is the hood going to be? And what color is the rest of the car going to be? And should I do something different with the roof line? And that was what had my interest when I was very young. One step backward to Eielson Air Force Base in Fairbanks. In the early part of the summer in 74, my dad had 2 weeks of vacation. So we flew, I think it was Fairbanks, Seattle, Chicago, Albany, New York, because my mom's side of the family was in Albany. And I remember distinctly waking up or being woken up by my father. shaking me awake one morning and said, "Bob, get up and get dressed, and hop in the car. We're going on an adventure." And that adventure was Watkins Glen for the 1974 6 hours at the Glen. And that was my introduction to sports car racing. That's 50 years ago this year that I first went to a racetrack with my dad.
So there's a lot to dig into there. And I'm thinking about our listeners, some of whom have probably attended NASCAR, maybe Le Mans racing, maybe IndyCar racing, maybe we watched it on television. And there's a lot of context that I think you're probably one of the very best people to provide to listeners who are trying to soak all this in. So one jumping off point is, you mentioned when your friend said, "I'm going to this 24 hours at Daytona, do you want to come down?" I think most people think of racing as you go to a track, the race starts at whatever given time during the day, emphasis during the day, and around 3 to 5 hours later, depending on the length, whether it's the Daytona 500 or it's a 300 or whatever the duration is or the distance is, it begins and it ends. You mentioned the 24 hours of Daytona, so probably people are thinking, how does that work? Doesn't it get dark? Can you kind of explain what the 24 hours of any 24-hour race really looks like, from a driver perspective, the best you can, and then from a photography and spectator perspective, because the difference is night and day, and that is pun intended.
Uh, Exactly. So in we call it endurance sports car racing. And one of the things that differ from that form of racing and what you might be more accustomed to, let's say IndyCar racing, is that endurance sports car racing is time limited. It's not racing to a specific distance. So you're racing for a certain amount of time, be it 24 hours or 12 hours or 6 hours or 2 hours and 45 minutes on the shortest end of the scale in IMSA racing. And the other thing that distinguishes endurance sports car racing from a rule standpoint is that you have multiple drivers. So it's not just a single driver who takes the green flag, drives all the way through the race, and takes the checkered flag, as at the Indianapolis 500. What you have in endurance sports car racing are two or sometimes three drivers, or it could be four drivers that could drive over the course of the race, depending on how long the race is. The shorter races that are under 3 hours, it'll be two drivers. 6 hours, 12 hours, you might see two drivers or three drivers in a car. 24-hour race, three drivers or four drivers in the car. And those drivers will take turns. One will start the race and do a couple of stints, meaning a stint would be from when the car starts until when it comes in for fuel and a change of tires. So you might have a driver go out and do a couple of stints, and then the next driver gets in and does a couple of stints. Or in the shorter races, one driver will start, middle of the race, car comes in, you change tires, you add fuel, you change the driver, and the second driver finishes the race. And in the longer races, you see a sunset. In a 12-hour race, you're going to see a sunset. In a 24-hour race, you're going to see a sunset and a sunrise. And from the driver's perspective, I imagine, it's in those longer events, it's finding time away from the car where you can head back to the RV and grab a couple hours of sleep when you're not scheduled to be in the car. For the photographer, it's a little bit of a different story, because in a 24-hour race, I will wake up on Saturday morning for Daytona at 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning, and I won't sleep again until approaching midnight on Sunday night.
Wow.
So I will be awake for over 36 hours, uh, sometimes, uh, over 40 hours sometimes.
How well lit is that track, if really at all, in the middle of the night to where you're able to actually create images, or are there different parts of the track that you're focusing on? Are you focused, I guess, on certain uh, potential photos during the daylight hours and different ones when it's totally night, or is it really no different? Are you doing what you're doing and it doesn't matter if it's day or night?
First, for nighttime at Daytona, it's remarkably light because the track itself has artificial light being
Mhm.
thrown down on the track all around the track.
Okay.
And I wouldn't say it's like shooting during the day. It's not that bright,
Mhm.
but I never shoot, well, I almost never shoot with a flash at Daytona. It's not necessary. There is enough light being thrown down that you can, with the proper exposure, you can see the cars just perfectly against a rather dark backdrop.
Now, would that be the
Um,
same for somewhere like Sebring, or is that a different animal?
Sebring is not as well lit as Daytona, but still key parts of the Sebring track have light on them.
Okay.
So it's not as no, it's not as well lit. But still, the places that I want to shoot when it's dark outside, the track usually has pretty good light being thrown down on it. So again, I rarely use a flash at Sebring as well. But there are other tracks that we have in the past photographed into the nighttime hours. For instance, one of them is Indianapolis Motor Speedway. Indianapolis Motor Speedway, because the Daytona 500 doesn't run at night, it doesn't have the type of artificial light or the amount of artificial light being thrown down on it that Daytona does. And so it's a little bit more of a challenge when the sun goes down at Indianapolis Motor Speedway to find your spots.
So, I've shot some IndyCar, some NASCAR, some Le Mans, and but obviously very limited relative to the work that you're doing. So my question is around track position. So, when I would shoot, for example, if I was at Richmond Motor Speedway, and they have these elevated platforms as they go around the oval, and the cars tend to, in a way, almost, I say it's almost like a fan from like high to low. They kind of fan
Mhm.
out, so even if someone is clearly in the lead, when they hit that bend, even that lead car is in one spot, but at least you can see the other cars in the frame often, just because of the angle they're coming
Yeah.
at you.
Yeah.
So, and I kind of, like that image, especially when, and the cars, you sometimes you get some action, leading into those where someone's trying to cut under someone, or whatever the case may be. How do you choose your location or locations during the course of a race where you really want to be to get the images that you want to get, or where you think some action may occur, that's indicative of telling the story of the race?
A few things factor into that equation. One is, how do you want to utilize the position of the sun? What time of day, what time of day do you need to be at each location to maximize how you want to make use of where the sun is in the sky?
Mm-hmm.
That's one factor. The second factor is, as you mentioned, how how do the cars, where are the cars going to be making passes? Where are the most likely places where there's going to be significant action going on, which is almost always at or near the corners. Most overtaking is done going into or coming out of a corner. And another factor is, how do you want to use elevation change in the photograph? Do you want to position yourself where you're at the bottom of the hill shooting up at the car? Do you want to shoot from the top of the hill shooting down at the car? And how do you want to, build the background of your photo? So most of the tracks that we shoot at, unlike NASCAR, unlike IndyCar, well, IndyCar does a lot of road course racing, and NASCAR is doing an increasing amount of road course racing. But when you think of the oval tracks, you think of very flat environments other than the bankings on the turns.
Mm-hmm.
In sports car racing on road courses, it's a lot of up and down
Mm-hmm.
and up and down. And for the photographer, that creates opportunities to change your perspective on both the car and how you utilize the background.
Yeah, I know, for me, my experience had been, as I mentioned, NASCAR, the oval courses. Then I had the chance to photograph the Baltimore Grand Prix, and that being a street race, I kind of fell in love with photographing the cars at the chicane because I found that, they would get, not fully, but partially airborne. You'd have sparks. So,
Yep.
for those listening, maybe if you can explain what a chicane is and then the purpose of it from a racetrack standpoint, and then what sort of images that environmental factor can cause with the cars to show motion and speed and that kind of thing.
So a chicane is a very short series of turns that's placed in the middle of a long straightaway. And it's usually a left-right type deal, or it might be a left-right-left, or the opposite of that. And its purpose is to slow the cars on a long straight so that at the end of that long straight, um, they're not going crazy speeds and creating more more danger than needs to be created in a motorsport event, which is kind of antithetical to think about because it's inherently a dangerous sport. But that is the purpose of a chicane is to slow the cars on a long straight in order to ultimately protect the drivers and the cars.
Yeah, and I just, I would see them, if you think about it, if you're just, for example, for people who are just driving a normal car, not in a race, if you're driving down the road and it's, let's say, a very, it's a long stretch of road, it's a half a mile long. If in that stretch you had a traffic circle and you had to kind of bear to your right, then bear to your left,
Yep.
naturally you're going to slow down so you don't, lose control of the car. And that's the same way it works essentially with a chicane, because by the time you bear right in the traffic circle, bear left in the traffic circle, then you go straight again. But in a race car situation, once you go straight again, shortly thereafter, you're going to have a turn. So
Yeah.
that way it kind of moderates the speed. But cars traveling at, 160, 170 miles an hour, if they're slowing to 80 miles an hour, 90 miles an hour, oftentimes when they negotiate the chicane, some part of that vehicle could be a front left tire, right tire, could be the whole front. It'll get slightly airborne, sometimes more than slightly, but you have debris and other things that kind of fly out, and photographically it's very obvious that this car is really moving. Is that, I mean, I'm sure that's kind of your experience to an extent.
So most of the chicanes that we're talking about at their entry point and their apex point, the apex point is where the car is closest to the edge of the track, let's call it that. When it's turning left, the apex is on the left side of the car, and it's where the wheels touch that inside part of the track. And what the track designers will do in the track construction will put curbing, low curbing at those points.
Okay.
And what will happen is the drivers, of course, want to find the fastest way through the chicane. And the fastest way through the chicane is almost always utilizing the curbing. And
Mm.
don't think of curbing as a big steep curb like you see in your local neighborhood. It's more of a gradual thing, but still at 100, 120 miles per hour, it's enough to launch the
It's a
cars.
ramp.
And to your point at Baltimore, yes, I remember that chicane. And I was one of my clients at the time was Falcon Racing, and I remember having a great shot of I used a real slow shutter speed and was tracking the car along as it was going through the chicane, and I have a couple of series where the car is, I don't know, I'm probably misremembering, but it seems like the inside tires were maybe 12 inches, maybe more off the ground at times on a really aggressive lap. And yes, it makes for some rather startling visual, very impactful moments.
Yeah, I had been shooting for a magazine at that time, and part of that assignment was photographing the actor turned racer Patrick Dempsey. And so he had his silver Porsche that he was racing in that race. And yeah, I've got some shots like we're talking about where you wonder, is the car going to flip over? Now I tell you one thing that I learned while shooting specifically the Baltimore race. When I am not a motorsports photographer. I'm a sports photographer, wildlife photographer, cultural photographer. But what I realized very quickly is, you can photograph a wedding. I can photograph a wedding. It's not our specialty, but we have an eye, and we could make it work. The difference is when you talk to someone who is a specialist in a particular field, you realize that whatever you thought you knew is literally a fraction of what there is to know. And so in Baltimore, I came to see in the media room and the photography room photographers who were specialists, and one of the big things that I came to see that I never would have thought is photographing the back of the race car as it goes down the track, and whether it was sparks coming off of it, or other things. I had never in my life thought, why would I photograph the back of the car? And I didn't realize what I didn't know. So, from your perspective as a motorsports photographer, what do you see photographing, the rear of the vehicle that brings a lot to the table that photographing the front or the side may not bring?
Well, and getting back to what we were talking about a little bit ago about, how do you decide where to be and when to be there, and that factors into the equation as well because you're always thinking about how do I compose an image? How do I tell the full story? And part of that is showing where the car has been. Part of that is showing where the car is going next. And there's a certain amount of expectation in that the viewer is looking at a photo of a car going away and thinking, what's next for that car? And
Mm-hmm.
and in telling the story of a race, that's part of it. And yeah, like you, I was the same way when I started out. It was all about photographing the fronts and the sides of the cars, and I didn't really think about uh, the other options. But it just creates a different feel in a photo, looking at a photo of a car that's moving out of the frame rather than coming toward you. In terms of again, like I said, thinking about what's next, what's coming up, what's over that hill, what's around that next bend.
I was talking to a photographer the other day about how you could have five photographers doing street photography, or for that matter, shooting an NFL football game, and they could all be next to each other. And then everybody's photographing for 15 minutes. If those photographers showed their top 10 pictures from that 15 minutes all bunched up together, there would be a number of photos that people would say, I didn't see that. How did you see that? And it's,
Yeah.
well, you were looking this way, I was looking that way. And so, so much of photography is about seeing even before you get to the fundamentals of f-stop, shutter speed, etc. And like me, shooting the front of the car, the side of the car, fairly obvious vantage points. Then you layer on, as you said, the back of the car and where the car is going. And it leads me to one of the early times where I saw an image and I thought, that is so unbelievably cool. And that was in, I believe, the Porsche Club of America magazine. And it was I want to say a forest or trees that seemed to be in like a state of blur. But then if you looked in between the foliage, there was a Porsche that was perfectly sharp. And I thought, well, maybe a bird shot this because, who had the eye, the talent, even the thought to do what appeared to be maybe a panning shot or something. And, as you and I talked about when we had our podcast pre-call, this ability to capture those images has become something of your signature. So maybe kind of explain that perspective and what led you to even think about that, let alone create those beautiful images that you've been doing.
It might have the photo that you're thinking of from the Porsche Club of America magazine panorama may have been around the 2014 timeframe. And if it was, it very likely was my photo and my story in the magazine. I was doing a lot of writing at the time as well. That particular photo and that opening layout won an award that year from the Motor Press Guild as the photograph of the year. And it was a photograph of the Paul Miller Racing, then Porsche 911 GT3 RSR trees. Yes, that was a photograph that was taken at Baltimore.
Oh, wow.
Baltimore.
Huh.
And
That's
I
awesome.
was standing on the top of the garage near the exit of one of the corners,
Mm-hmm.
and the cars would come almost directly underneath. And there were a couple of trees that were growing, and it just became an opportunity to utilize those trees in the shot as I was shooting straight down on the car. And the cool thing about that photo for me is that one of my signatures has become the motion blur shot. It's a shot where you close the aperture down and you have to lengthen the amount of exposure time in order to let in enough light to get the correct exposure. And what that requires you to do is be very precise in how you move the camera, because you might be leaving the shutter open for a fourth of a second or an eighth of a second.
Mm-hmm.
And at 150 miles an hour, the car moves a long way in a quarter of a second. For that particular photo, and I don't remember the exact specs, but I was probably shooting at 1/20th of a second or something like that, because I wanted to get that feeling of blur in the trees being an identifiable stationary object. I knew that I could use the trees to convey the sense of speed that the car was going at the time. And yeah, that was the other thing about that photo is you wouldn't even have thought that that was from Baltimore, a
No,
street
definitely
race.
not. No, if you had said that, that you're somewhere near the Audubon, or some sort of fairly, exotic international locale, yeah, I'd believe it. Now, downtown Baltimore, I do believe you, but you never would have thought it was Baltimore. You're right.
Nope, nope. A friend and I, Marshall Pruitt does work for Racer Magazine. Marshall Pruitt and I were the ones who kind of scouted that location and found that location the first year that Baltimore was being utilized for the IndyCar and American Le Mans Series races. And that was a really cool find,
Absolutely.
that
Absolutely.
location.
Yeah, no, it definitely was. So let me get into the weeds a little bit here. When people photograph airplanes, they photograph helicopters. There's this balance between getting a sharp image and also having a shutter speed that's not so fast that the blade becomes still. Then it looks like the blade's not moving. It looks like, how is the plane flying because the propellers aren't working.
Yeah.
So in auto racing, you kind of want to have that wheel with some degree of blur because it's going fast, but yet you want the image to be sharp, the body to be sharp. So how do you bridge that gap between sharp image but still showing the motion of a wheel in motion?
Let's say I'll 75% agree with what you just said
I'll,
because
I'll take it.
there's other ways to show the motion and the action. For instance, we were talking earlier about the drivers using curbing essentially as launching pads.
Mhm.
I can shoot if the car's in the air, I can shoot that car at 1/8,000th of a second
Yeah,
at f2.8 and freeze that car so you can't see hardly any motion. But the fact that it's in the air lets the viewer know how much is going on with that driver at that exact moment.
sure. Sure. So essentially
So
that, yeah, it offs the heat or the airborne aspect kind of offsets that the wheel is not moving essentially.
yes,
Yeah.
so that's the 25%. The 75% that I agree with you on is yes, you do need to show at least, or you do want to show at least a little bit of motion in the wheels. And a lot of that's dependent on what angle you're shooting the car from. If you're shooting the car from a head-on position, the angle of the wheel is such that a little bit of motion is going to blur out the spokes of the wheel.
Mhm.
Whereas if you're shooting the car from the side, you need more of that rotation in order to show a significant amount of speed. So I have a general rule, very general rule, and a lot of it is dependent on how fast the car is going in a given corner or on a given straightaway. But a general rule that from the front, I want 1/320th of a second or a third of a stop on either side of that
Mhm.
to start to build that motion in the wheels. If the car is like a 3/4 front, and from the side, I want 1/200th of a second or slower below 1/100th, 1/50th, 1/4
Wow.
to show the amount of speed that I want to show. So it's dependent on your position with respect to the car, how much latitude you take with the shutter speed.
So when you have that car that's coming around a corner towards you, are you focusing on, the middle of the hood? Are you focusing on the wheel well that's turning towards you? I'm just thinking in terms of f-stop and focus, sharp focus for the majority of the front of that car. Kind of the focus point if you're at f2.8 or if you're even at f2.8.
Focus point is something that has rapidly changed in the last few years as the technology has gotten better and better for autofocus.
Mm-hmm.
99% of what I shoot is on continuous autofocus and a continuous shutter release as well. So pushing my finger down and I'm holding it down and I'm taking a burst of 4, 5, 6, 8 photos at a time
Hmm.
and hoping to get the key moment
Sure.
in sharp focus. Modern cameras, the cameras that are coming out today, they can identify the object and follow that object through its through all the motion that occurs as you track it and never let go of the focus. Whereas I'm still using equipment that's single point autofocus, and I move the point
Hmm.
around the frame to adjust it in a way that the car is where I want it compositionally within the frame.
Hmm.
So most of my equipment still utilizes that selectable single point
Hmm.
autofocus. What I look for in picking a point to focus on is I want that focus point to be on the front half of the car because I almost always want, unless I'm photographing the back of the car. If I'm photographing the car from the front or the side, I want that focus point to be on the front half of the car. And I need it to be in a spot where there's good contrast, good light to dark contrast, because that's what the camera likes to be able to lock on and maintain good autofocus. A lot of times on the car, as the car is coming toward me, okay, that point of contrast is where the windshield and the hood meet. Windshield hood usually creates a very dark to light contrast point that the camera likes to lock onto. It really depends on the situation.
One of the things that surprised me that I had to kind of think through was the effect that the heat from the engines of the cars, the ripples, and then especially as the race wears on, that the heat coming off the track itself.
Oh.
How do you, either in shutter speed or f-stop or some other form or fashion, how do you try to deal with the heat conditions and the heat ripples? And I deal with it with shooting, sports. It could be baseball, could be football, but especially in motorsports where that heat is a whole other level of heat. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, and that's heat haze is kind of the bane of our existence in a lot of ways, because during the hot summer months when the sun is highest in the sky, you're very often in the situation where you're shooting over significant amounts of asphalt before the car is in the frame. And the longer the stretch of asphalt that you have to shoot over, the more the heat haze is going to impact how the amount of detail that the image is going to be able to show. And I remember we used to go to Utah Motorsports Park. It was called Utah Motorsports Park at the time. And this was outside of Salt Lake City. And we would shoot the start shot at the end of this really long front straight. And it's a head-on shot. And when the heat haze was bad, it was, I don't want to compare it to a Monet painting, but in terms of just splashes of color in basic shapes, that's what you were looking at. You were seeing no fine detail in any of the cars some of the times when you're shooting that start shot, depending on how hot it was and how much humidity was in the air and how much water was soaked into the track from the rainstorm the night before and all of these factors. And yeah, it'll drive you nuts when you're in a situation where the shots that you want to normally get, you can't because there's not enough detail that can be captured between you and the car. And at that time, you're looking for the places you're looking for the places on the track where you minimize the amount of area of asphalt that you have to shoot over. That's a pretty good general rule. So to the extent that you can shorten that distance, you lessen the amount of haze that you're having to shoot through, and you're increasing the amount of detail that you can capture. And sometimes what you're stuck with is shooting side pan shots as the cars drive by, and not shooting a whole lot of shots of the cars coming at you, because you can't figure out a way to eliminate that haze. Again, there's that occasional moment when you're at Utah Motorsports Park, and you look at your shot in the media center afterwards and you go, Monet would dig this.
Well, yeah, it becomes like an abstract, but no, that's yeah, it's definitely a challenge. So I know people are going to ask this question, so I will, and that is, when you go out to the track for a typical race, what sort of lens assortment do you leave the house with typically?
I leave the house with 4 or 5 bodies
Mhm.
and 4 or 5 lenses. My lenses range from 14-24 2.8, 24-70 2.8. I've got a 50 to 100 1.8. I have a 70 to 200 2.8, which is de rigueur. It's the lens that everybody has to have.
Mhm.
That in the 24 to 70 are the lens that everybody has to have.
Sure.
And then my long lens is typically a 120 to 300 2.8. Although at some tracks, I'll take a 150 to 600 instead of the 120 to 300 if I feel like I need the extra length. So those are the lenses that are in my bag at any given race event. Once a lens goes onto a camera body, it stays there for the entirety of the weekend. It never comes off that camera body, because I don't want to introduce dust and dirt and all of that into the system that wasn't there at the beginning of the weekend. That's what I have in my bag, lens wise.
So
And depending on where I am and what situations I'm shooting will dictate what lenses I have. Usually I have 2 or 3 lenses with me, and camera bodies with me at any given point in time. And if I'm out on the track, I've got the 120 to 300, the 70 to 200, and a 24 to 70 in case I have any close action that I need to capture. Whereas if I'm in the pits or in the paddock, I'll have I'll have a 14 to 24 2.8, or I'll have my 50 to 100 1.8 with me, because I don't need all of that. I don't need all of that length that the 70 to 200 and the 120 to 300 offer me.
and with the lenses that you just described, is it a matter of flexibility or just lens look that has you choosing, it sounds like, almost exclusively zooms versus a mix of zooms and primes?
I have no primes in
Mhm.
my bag, and a lot of the photographers are shooting, especially on the short end, the 50 millimeter 1.4, or something like that, because the bokeh that you get with those prime lenses when they're wide open is super cool. But I've always liked the flexibility that the zoom range gives me. Even on the shorter end, from 14 to 24 is a pretty significant a pretty significant difference, even though 24 is still pretty wide.
Mhm.
So again, it comes down to the situation and deciding, how I want to represent a certain situation. And for instance, if I'm not standing trackside, I might be in the paddock, and the guys might be wrenching on the cars, and the car might be up in the air, and I'm crawling down underneath the car with my camera equipment to photograph the guys doing their work. And the unsung heroes are the crew guys who are
Oh yeah.
fixing the car and implementing the setup and all of that, when the car is not physically on the track. And I like capturing those guys as much as I like capturing the cars. But if I'm crawling underneath a car with those guys, I can't be shooting that with a 120 to 300. I need my 14 to 24.
Sure. So here's a question. If you're heading on vacation you're not shooting motorsports, and you can take one lens with you, what lens would that be?
This is a point of contention between myself and my wife at this moment.
But this is the only point of contention.
This is a point of contention between me and my wife at this moment.
Okay.
I told you earlier that I used to build my vacations around photography, right? Where am I going to be for the sunrise? Where am I going to be for the sunset? And where am I going to be every minute in between?
Mm.
And when I made photography my living, the passion that I had for photography waned. I'm very satisfied with my career choice, and I've been immensely happy in the arc of my photography career. But holding a camera in my hand is no longer my passion, it's my job.
Hmm.
And so it's a little bit different now when we go on vacation because my wife will say, Bob, we're going to be in this really beautiful location. You should bring some of your camera equipment. And I say to her, what's your photography budget?
I
Because
love that.
I don't want to think the way that I used to think on vacations about, how am I going to maximize the amount of awesome photography that I get
Sure.
out of this? I just want to be walking down the street holding hands with my wife, trying to figure out whether we're going to turn left at this corner or turn right at this corner, and whether we're going to go see that church or whether we're going to go down to the waterside and watch the people rowing their boats go by. The photography at that point takes a significant backseat to the rest of the vacation experience. I love my cell phone,
Yeah.
and I will utilize that for 98% of my vacation photography at this point.
Well, as an economics major and a former, tech consultant, it probably surprises nobody that previously you would plan every moment of every vacation based on the photographic opportunities. So, yeah, no, I understand that, you sort of turn the page on things, and, it's a career. And so your downtime is your downtime. And
Yep.
that makes sense.
From stepping back into my economics life, maximization of utility.
Oh, yeah, there's
How
there's a term. So
how are you gonna enjoy your time the most? And on vacation now, I enjoy my time my most, letting my wife plan everything and just being there with her. And back then it was, and she would roll her eyes at the time. I can't even believe, just roll her eyes. You mean we have to be awake at 6:30 in the morning? Well, the sun comes up at 7:15.
makes perfect sense to me. So let me ask you this. There's people who like every type of car. Your dad really appreciated the Corvair, and obviously the Camaro, and you have your people who like Ferraris and Mustangs, and on and on. So much of what you have done has been owning and photographing Porsches. And whether a person owns a Porsche, aspires to own a Porsche, doesn't want to own a Porsche whatsoever, which is, by the way, the least expensive way to appreciate a Porsche. What do you think it is about that make, and maybe even especially the 911, that captures the imagination of so many people?
Boy, that's a great question. And I'll go back to that first experience that I had at the racetrack in 1974. That was at the Watkins Glen 6 Hours. And what I remember at turn two was the Porsche 911 of Hurley Haywood and Peter Gregg coming by through turn two, and the blat of that motor was something that was so different than anything else that was on the track at the time. And that's what I remember, is that car. I don't remember the prototypes. I don't remember the two prototypes that won the race. I remember that car coming by and that sound that it was making. that just captured my interest in a way that wasn't captured by the top class cars, the prototypes at the time. That I've carried that through all through this years. My primary interest has always been on the race cars that were built from the road going cars, not the prototypes, not the
Mhm.
open wheel Formula One cars or Indy cars. I like the cars that you can tie back
Mhm.
to the street version of the car. And you can't find another model of car that has now what is a 60 years continuous of racing, other than I guess you could put the Corvette in that equation.
Sure. Yeah.
But there's nothing that has the length of competitiveness and dominance that the Porsche 911 has had through the years.
Yeah, yeah, no, I agree. In my area in Maryland and surrounding areas, Virginia, PA, there's a lot of car shows. And one of the things that I really enjoy when I've been to some of these are photographing the details of the vehicle. Obviously, the vehicle's not moving. And usually the owners are only too happy for you to,
Hmm.
not necessarily sit in the car, but the windows are down, or that they will happily open the door. They're proud of these cars. And I have found that, especially with some of the older cars, just the instrument gauges and the dashboards and the wheels, and it's that expression, they don't make them like they used to. Some of these details are remarkable. And a car show, for example, is accessible to virtually anybody. Very often there's no charge to go as someone to just see the cars. They probably make their money on whatever vendors are there, et cetera. So I'm thinking, if you were to advise hobbyist photographers about photographing cars for maybe the first time, or maybe they enjoy it now, would you have any advice for them, whether it's their own car that they want to kind of capture a cool picture with the sunset, or details like I just mentioned at a car show? Are there any kind of thoughts or words of advice you might have for people who enjoy doing that?
Well, one thing is that many towns will have once every month a Sunday morning where they call it Cars and Coffee. And the cars will start showing up at 7 o'clock in the morning and they'll stay until noon or thereabouts. And it will be at a local strip mall where there's a Starbucks or something, and people can get their coffee and a croissant or whatever, and open up their chairs and sit back and talk about cars. And boy, there's a wealth of good machinery that comes from out of the garages on Cars and Coffee Day that you don't normally see on the street from day to day. Most of these cars are driven sparingly at this point. 50-year-old car is not your typical grocery getter. So that's a great thing, is to look for a local Cars and Coffee
Mm-hmm.
where you have all of those cars coming together. And like you said, the owners love having attention heaped on their cars. And so if you want the door open and looking inside and see what the dashboard looks like, and what the steering wheel and the iconic logo in the center of the steering wheel or whatever, all of those become opportunities for your camera to show an amount of context that you wouldn't necessarily think could be shown by focusing on such a small detail. But the people who know cars will know, well, that steering wheel is from a 1967 Ford Mustang.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really it's that level of detail that that some of these people are into cars.
I can't even
And the other thing about those types of situations, the cars and coffee car show kind of situations, is that you are focusing on details and less on backgrounds. So you don't worry about whether or not there's some distracting element just beyond the car,
Mhm.
because a lot of times your camera is not focused on anything other than the surface of the car. And so that's an opportunity for macro photography a lot of times. And yeah, you'll have your 24 to 70 with you, and you'll step back and you'll take shots of the overall scenes and how the cars are sitting next to each other, and a lot of times you'll find some artistic viewpoints that way. But a lot of times you're 2.8 and 70 millimeters, or 2.8 and 135 millimeters, and just focusing on these really cool details. Then you take the car out of that environment, and then you start thinking about, okay, I want to take beautiful pictures of this car. And then you start thinking about some of the things I was talking about earlier. You start thinking about how the elevation changes and what things you want to utilize in the background and how clean you want your background to be. Sometimes you want your background to be a forest on a windy road, and sometimes you want your background to be a warehouse
Mhm.
in the warehouse district, and you want your car to be placed in front of open doors, and there's blackness within, and your car is, your white car is offsetting the blackness behind, but it's all surrounded by this industrial look.
Mhm.
And so it all becomes about, how do you want to build your backgrounds, and what message do you want to convey to the viewer about the story of the car?
Yeah, there's so much there. And with these cars and coffee and the car shows, sometimes the owners are such characters that they are incredible portrait opportunity. I've seen so many cars where the owner has matched the exterior color to the fuzzy dice.
Yep.
So you get every variety. So, well, Bob, I really want to thank you for your generosity of time and taking that time to talk. And I know that we'll have people who want to know where they can check out more of your work, and where they can go on social media to see what you have going on. Where are some places that they can do that?
Really, the best place at this point is Instagram. I was a late adopter of Instagram. I'm a late adopter of about everything at this point. I'm 56. I think you said you were 56 as
Yeah.
well. I'm 56, and for being in an industry that is technology dependent, I'm a bit of a Luddite. I'm anti-technology. So I was a very late adopter of Instagram, but that's probably the best place at this point to see a good range of my client work. And my Instagram handle is Bob_Autosport_image. Autosport Image is the business that myself and a business partner started back in 2002.
Well, and I can tell people who are listening that, if you have just interest in photography, let alone motorsport photography, you owe it to yourself. Just check it out, because it will inspire you. It'll motivate you to get out there, and it's really, really super impressive. So definitely want to thank Bob for joining. And for everybody listening, if you want to know what I have going on, as Bob said himself, check out my work on Instagram, where I'm Mitch Stringer Images. You can also go to mitchstringerimages.com. But I'd say probably Instagram is updated very frequently. If you have any questions, feel free to DM me. I get back to people pretty quickly. So that's a good resource for you. And I encourage you to do so. I get a lot of questions about gear, or questions about upcoming events, questions about workshops, and so forth. So feel free to reach out. I will get back to you. And until our next episode, I wish you great light. I wish you happy shooting, and we'll talk again soon.